What is up, everybody across the plane? This is John TheMorgile here. Gonna do a fairly quick response video to a video from a character by the name of VoySovReason. This was actually from a couple years ago, but he had it listed as a response to one of my arguments or to one of my flat Earth claims or proofs related to orbital mechanics. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to respond to his claims in a civilized fashion anyway, because this is a really big proof, as far as I'm concerned, against the physical possibility of orbital mechanics, that is. So let's get into his response, and I will respond in kind. Enjoy.
This is going to be a brief video response to TheMorgile. He and I have been discussing a number of things about the flat Earth, and specifically gravity and orbits. He says that orbits are not possible. Specifically, he says that two bodies rotating around each other, such as the Earth and the Moon, cannot possibly do that while rotating around another object, such as the Sun.
Okay, that's sort of a half-truth there. I would just mention that third-generation satellite orbits, such as the Moon around the Earth, which is allegedly in motion, around the Sun, which is also allegedly in motion, is impossible strictly using the theories of gravity in the void of space-time, which we'll get into in a little bit greater detail. But I just wanted to make that distinction because you're making it seem as if I ever claimed that, objects can't rotate around one another, which, that is missing the crux of the argument. So let's continue.
So I'm going to demonstrate that not only is that possible, but I can recreate it right in my own living room. Okay, first I wanted to show you just one object simulating an orbit. This is a grapefruit just swinging around on a string. There's no other forces acting on it other than the laws of physics.
I suppose we can let this slide for argument's sake, but I would just point out that in the heliocentric theory, there is no string tied to the ceiling that's keeping the Earth or the Moon or the Sun or anything up. Just a little minor detail I wanted to point out, but we'll let it slide for argument's sake. And, of course, the first argument that's going to come from Team Heliocentric is that, well, it doesn't need to be a string in space because gravity, because, the Earth is so big and the Moon is so big that gravity allows for this, and gravity sort of behaves as a string. But that really isn't even getting it either, because in order for your experiment to be, a scaled down representation using a string as the force of gravity, the string would need to be tied more or less to the equator of a moving object, not hanging down from the ceiling. So in other words, you could take a piece of string with a weight at the end and spin that around your fingers, but having the string tied to the ceiling is kind of sort of cheating. And of course, having the string there at all is kind of sort of cheating, but having the thing not tied to the more or less ecliptic or equator of a moving object is also kind of sort of cheating. But again, we'll let all this slide just for argument's sake. I wish globe earthers would lend the same courtesy to flat earthers, but I guess that will probably never happen. Not that flat earthers want to cheat. I guess what I'm saying is, just to allow certain axioms or certain premises to stand for argument's sake. But anyway, I digress.
It's going in a circle because there are two forces really acting at the same time: centrifugal force and centripetal force. Centripetal force is the inward force. In this case, that's being applied by the string. In an orbit, that would be gravity. So if this were like the Moon going around the Earth would be in the center, and it would be pulling on the Moon, pulling it towards the center.
Yeah, indeed. The Earth would be pulling the Moon towards the center, not attached to a string some dozens of Earth distances above the Earth, But yeah, okay. We said we'd let that slide.
We're simulating that here because we don't have objects as big as the moon, so we have to simulate it. The string is providing that force.
I really just have to comment really quick. One of the things that I find really amusing about heliocentric logic is that we're expected to believe gravity only applies to objects that are so large, such as the spherical Earth, the spherical moon. But, pretty much everything else in nature is scalable. So, let's just say that the Earth is, I don't know, however many times larger than the moon, and the moon is however many times larger than you or me, and so they exhibit or they generate gravity in space-time. But wouldn't anything generate similar gravity? So let's say you had a grapefruit. Shouldn't that generate enough gravity to spin a grape around it? And of course, you would say that's ridiculous. But again, in nature and in lots of applied fields, I won't even try to start naming them, but phenomenon are scalable. So it doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter how large or how small a thing is. It should generate as much gravity, pound for pound, as an object of a similar shape that's a million times bigger, right? So let's just say the Earth is a million times bigger than a grapefruit. Then the grapefruit should generate gravity that's a million times lesser than the Earth, logically. But of course, that's going to be number crunched down, and I'm going to be called a fool, but from where I'm sitting, gravity doesn't exist. But just thinking about this logically, knowing that gravity doesn't exist, it is, you could argue that gravity should be generated by all objects, not just the big ones.
It's pulling the orange inward. That's the centripetal force. The centrifugal force is counteracting that force because it has momentum. It's been pushed by me, so it's moving in a circle. It's sometimes called a fictitious force because it's not really a force like gravity is.
Okay, so wait a minute. You're saying that centrifugal force is a fictitious force, parroting Newton. That's fine. To parrot Newton, of course. We won't get into that. But it's not a real force like gravity is. Okay, so wait a minute. Centrifugal force is more or less the natural effect of angular acceleration when you're dealing with a rotational frame of reference. But centrifugal force is very real. It's measurable. It's repeatable. Anybody can demonstrate centrifugal force. If you've ever been on a merry-go-round or at the gravitron at the fair, centrifugal force acts on all bodies in motion around a central radius or in a rotational frame of reference. And, you can parrot Newton, like I said, and call it a fictitious force, but to say in the same breath that gravity is a real force is just absurd. Just absurd.
It is a kind of resulting force. It's resulting from the tendency of an object to want to go in a straight line. And when you force it to go into a circle, then it resists that. So it pulls outward. So the string is pulling it in, but it wants to go out. So that results in a circle. So we have a balance of the centrifugal force and the centripetal force. So in this demonstration, we are actually using the actual Earth's gravity to simulate the gravity in the center of the orbital system. This is because the Earth's gravity is pulling straight down on the grapefruit, but the string prevents it from going straight down. So it does the next best thing. It pulls it inward. So that downward force of the actual gravity being resisted by the string results in an inward force, giving us our centripetal force in this case.
Well, actually, it is the natural density of the fruit that is causing it to tend towards the ground, to fall. It isn't gravity that's doing that. Just want to get this in here. Gravity is a theory to explain the phenomenon, what goes up must come down, assuming that the Earth is a spinning sphere. Okay? So in that respect, gravity doesn't exist. Again, it's a theory to explain a phenomenon, what goes up must come down. And people like Neil deGrasse.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. Okay, next question. It's called gravity.
Will claim that demonstrating what goes up must come down by dropping something onto the ground somehow proves gravity or demonstrates gravity, but it does not. Again, that is because gravity is a theory to explain that phenomenon. So, to put this in analogy, if I have a theory that what goes up must come down is caused by natural density, or let's just say the density and buoyancy, and or that the fundamental force that provides the tendency for higher density objects to fall towards the ground is the static electric charge of the Earth, in theory, then if I drop something and it falls to the ground, does that prove my theory? Well, no, it doesn't. So just wanted to get that in there because it is an important distinction to make. But, okay, so again, I'd already said that I'll let the whole string dangling from the ceiling slide, but it is nothing akin to what's supposedly going on in an orbital relationship. But for your demonstrational purposes, we'll go ahead and let that go for argument's sake.
So that's how this simulation works. Okay, now I'm demonstrating a two-body orbit, such as the Earth and the Moon. Now, notice how I've just given them a little spin and they're orbiting around each other. Now, we usually say that the Moon revolves around the Earth, but really they both revolve around each other. They revolve around a point, which is the center of gravity of the two objects, called the barycenter. In the case of the Earth-Moon system, since the Earth is much more massive than the Moon, the barycenter is actually within the diameter of the Earth. But if you were really to see closely the orbit of the Earth and the Moon, you would see that the Earth does wobble a little bit because they are rotating around a barycenter. Okay, now we get to the three-body orbit. This is the thing that you say is impossible. Now, I know you're going to say there's only two bodies here. What are you talking about? No, there's really three. The Earth is the third body in this demonstration. The Earth is providing the gravity pulling straight down, and that pulls the entire system toward the center of where the string is hanging.
Okay, that argument there is absolutely inadequate, and I'll explain why, and we'll also let it slide for argument's sake. But you're saying that the fruit, both of these fruits, are orbiting the Earth, the actual Earth, hypothetically the spherical Earth? No, that's ridiculous. And I wouldn't say anything about there only being two bodies because your demonstration here proves my point perfectly, even with just the two bodies, because the larger fruit is in motion around a central point. But I disagree with your claim that this is somehow representative of an orbital relationship. And even throwing the string problems aside and all that, it's not, because again, the string would need to be attached to the ecliptic, not to the ceiling, and all of these objects would need to be in motion far out of scale with what you have, and we'll even let the scale slide because your demonstration actually proves my point. But just to keep in the back of your mind while viewing this, in order for the scale to be even close, the smaller fruit would need to go some 30 larger fruit diameter distances away in its orbit, right? Because they claim that the moon is like 238,000 miles away, and is claimed that the Earth's spherical Earth's diameter is 8,000 miles, give or take. But the reason that scale is so important, and we'll dissect this a bit more here in a minute, but scale is important because of the distance that the smaller object must travel in each orbit. So let's continue.
So by giving the Earth-Moon system, my fruits, a little twist, I just twisted the string, by the way. You can do this experiment yourself, and I hope you will. I twisted the string around so that they're going to tend to spin around each other, and then I gave the main string a spin around a central point, and this is the result. And you can see What you say is impossible is happening right here in my living room with just the laws of physics.
I would say that what you're demonstrating in your living room would be impossible if you didn't have the string, but again, we'll let the string slide because we're assuming that gravity is the string, right? But let's take a look at the patterns that this thing makes, because it's the exact same patterns that I got when I animated this a long time ago, several times actually.
The Earth-Moon system rotates around a central point, and that central point rotates around the center of gravity, in this case would be the sun. So this is how it works. If you look at the path of the moon, you will see that it does go in kind of a corkscrew path, like you say, but there's not a problem. All it knows is that it's being pulled. It's being pulled by the Earth's gravity.
Okay, so you obviously weren't paying any sort of attention to the problem that I was pointing out with the heliocentric theory. Now, the biggest problem that I have is the fact that it takes about 14 days for the half moon to go through its phases, through the new moon, through the crescents to the half moon. That's 14 days. And then back from the other half moon through the full moon phases to the first half moon is also 14 days. So in your experiment, you can clearly see this corkscrew pattern, which with a moon, or the object that's representative of the moon in this example, is traveling in the same direction as the larger fruit, the Earth. It must go along a much larger arc than when it's traveling in the opposite direction as the Earth. So right here, swing way around. If you could just draw a line and then look at this little swing, little loop-de-loop, little curly Q, back to the big, long, right. So if we were to say that it takes the exact same amount of time for the moon to do the little corkscrew as you see right about here, that little corkscrew, as it does for it to do this large corkscrew, right? Now the problem is that it's claimed that the moon travels at a relatively consistent speed relative to the Earth, which is, I believe, 2,288 miles an hour at all times. So that really isn't adding up, because how is it possible for the moon to accelerate along this much wider arc around the outside of the track and then decelerate here when it should technically be accelerating? It doesn't make any sense. That is the problem. The problem isn't so much, physically being able to loop things around one another with strings, no less, and I'll give you the strings and I'll give them to you tied to the ceiling. The problem is the fact that the moon is allegedly making these totally not elliptical or circular at all, but instead very sinusoidal, or, like you said, corkscrewy patterns in consistent time frames for half of the orbit and the other half of the orbit. One is when it's going along a much wider arc in 14 days. The other is when it's going along a much shorter path, also in 14 days. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to time this out frame by frame and see how long it takes for the moon to do each one of these trajectories. Okay. So we're going to look at this event in a little bit more detail. As you can see, it's been slowed down, and you really can get a good feel for this corkscrew pattern that would necessarily be displayed by any object orbiting another object that's in motion, because during certain portions of the orbit, the secondary object, or the moon, would need to be racing against the primary object, or the Earth, and during other segments of the same orbit, the moon would need to be, racing towards the Earth, or racing in the opposite direction as the Earth. And so the only possible way that this can happen at all is if the moon accelerates greatly, decelerates greatly at times, depending on where it is in its orbit. But furthermore, the moon would need to do this so perfectly and precisely so as to do it within about 14 days during each half moon to half moon phase. So we'll take a look at the frame count here. That first little portion that we saw right here is 48 frames. The second portion that we're going to see here, that's 39 frames. Just freeze frame it there, go on to the next, that's 26 frames. And to the next is 45 frames. So you'll see right off the bat, and I'll keep rolling this with the number of frames for each segment, but right off the bat you'll see that there is not any sort of consistency in terms of the time that it takes for the moon in this example to go from the right of the Earth to the left of the Earth. Okay? And I could have been more specific and, had this be representative of the half moons, which probably would have been better, but we'll just say from the right of the Earth to the left of the Earth to make it easier, because the half moons would be, well, a little bit more difficult to estimate where the sun is in this example. I guess it would be right in the middle, and I could do it the other way, but I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time on this because the point is proven very nicely. Now, what you'll see is that the smaller fruit, or the moon in this example, is absolutely not taking consistent periods of time, which is tracked by the number of frames. It's not taking consistent periods of time to do one orbit or to do half of an orbit. Okay, and when you're looking at this, as you can clearly see that there are large arcs that the orbital, the third generation orbital body would need to traverse. In order for it to do that during the same amount of times as the smaller portions of the arc, it would need to accelerate and decelerate. Now this first portion here, as you can see, that's a smaller arc, was 48 frames. This larger arc here is 39 frames. The next, sort of a large arc as well, 26 frames. So far I can tell that the orbital body, the moon, is accelerating during the larger arcs. And it must do that. It must swing around and beat out the Earth, or the larger fruit, along its orbital trajectory in order for this whole thing to work. And so your experiment proved my point. In the heliocentric model, everything is governed by gravity and chaos. And based on your experiment, how likely would you say that it is for the moon to have an orbital relationship with the Earth so as to produce, say, full moon, then 14 days later a no moon, then 14 days later a full moon, and then 14 days later a no moon, forever and ever and ever and ever? Because according to you, what's going on with the Earth and the Moon orbital relationship is something akin to this half-assed experiment that will let all sorts of things slide and fly in order just to, for argument's sake. But we can clearly see that in order for the Moon or this fruit to orbit a larger body in motion, it has to accelerate and decelerate. So my big question is what is causing the Moon to accelerate and decelerate in such a way that we consistently get half moon 14 days, half moon 14 days, or full moon 14 days, no moon 14 days? This very, very precision, better than a fine-tuned watch precision of bodies in orbit that are supposedly, allegedly governed by nothing more than chaos and gravity. And the simple fact of the matter is, if we're being honest here and looking at this just, with this in mind, you're never, ever going to create an experiment where just by chance and chaos, and even you can use strings instead of gravity because gravity doesn't exist, and you're never going to demonstrate that in any sort of experiment. But you'll never, ever be able to demonstrate an orbital relationship where the smaller third-generation satellite body does orbits around the larger body in motion in consistent periods of time. And that is the main argument that I think you failed to realize the point. So hopefully this drives it home a little bit. So let's just continue on and wrap this up.
And the two of them together are being pulled by the sun's gravity. It's constantly being pulled. You said things in your video like it has to catch up with the Earth, or that it somehow that gravity has to take over at some point. No, gravity doesn't take over. It never stops. It's constant. It's constantly pulling on the moon and pulling it around the Earth, and the two of them pulling around the very center of the Earth-Moon system, and that whole thing is pulled around the sun.
Okay, now here's another problem with your reason. And this is not just you, this is heliocentric logic or illogic in general. But if you could imagine somehow that the entire system, say the house that the string is tied to, is in motion that is in conflict to the ecliptic plane that these two things are orbiting around. Which, by the way, that's another reason why your experiment doesn't work, because allegedly the Earth is not moving around a stationary sun, but moving around a sun that's in motion. But if you had the house, the entire house, let's say going straight up and to a 45-degree angle up and to the right, whatever, in a direction that's contrary to that motion of around the ecliptic plane that you have in your experiment. However, the only body that is tethered to the sun in motion, tethered by gravity, would be the Earth and not the moon. Allegedly, the moon is tethered to the Earth, and the Earth is tethered to the sun by gravity, in theory. So, in other words, in heliocentric theory, it's claimed that the Earth is large enough to reciprocate the sun's gravity, because it's much larger than the moon. However, the moon is not large enough to reciprocate the sun's gravity. Otherwise, wouldn't the moon sort of be orbiting the sun and not orbiting the Earth if the sun's gravity was affecting the moon? So the problem is if you put the whole thing in motion and only the Earth is affected by or is tethered to the sun by that motion, then you add in another layer of problems. Now, of course, you're never going to be able to demonstrate this with fruits and strings, but that is a pretty major problem, even just theoretically, on top of what I've mentioned. So, I just wanted to point that out because it's just so absurd. The heliocentric theory is really quite asinine, and the more you look into things like orbital mechanics and the perfect cyclical time frame for the moon's orbit, half moon to half moon or full moon to no moon, 14 days in between each of these, like clockwork, better than clockwork, really quite defies the illogic that claims the entire system is governed by chaos and gravity alone.
It is absolutely no problem. You just don't understand it. I've demonstrated it with just 2 fruits and some string, and you say it's impossible. This is how it works. This is how orbital mechanics works. It is not impossible.
I would say that is absolutely wrong. I do understand how orbital mechanics works in theory, but you don't seem to understand the problems that I'm pointing out, and it seems like you just refuse to look. But again, the problem that I'm stating here with orbital mechanics is the fact, an example, that it takes the moon 14 days to traverse from half moon to half moon and back every single time, no matter what, when it should be variable. That should be a variable time frame. And I'm not basing that on my thoughts or my feelings or my opinions, but this is based on the laws of physics. And your demonstration proved my point. So thank you for that. That was a really well done demonstration, and it proved my point with flying colors.
I also have it here for you. I've shown it from the bottom view. So you can see that, yes, indeed, the lemon does go in a corkscrew path. There's nothing pushing that other than the laws of physics. Gravity, centrifugal force, and centripetal force do it all. Just like it's doing it here in my living room, it does it out in space. Your biggest objections are just nonsense. They don't make any sense. It actually works perfectly fine. You just don't understand it.
And again, I do totally understand it. Finally, the problem is not so much the motion itself. Although your experiment wasn't really all that great. You do have strings when the heliocentric model has, well, a vacuum, which is quite the opposite of anything tensile or structural. But the biggest problem is, again, it's the time frame that this all occurs in. In order for the moon to go from half moon west of the Earth on the ecliptic to half moon east of the Earth on the ecliptic in 14 days, and then do the reverse also in 14 days, the only way that can happen is if the moon accelerates a great deal for the first leg and decelerates or even retrogrades for the second leg. And again, that is to make both legs exactly 14 days. Okay, so that is the problem. And good luck demonstrating that, and good luck, convincing your house to travel at a 45-degree angle up and to the right, along a curved path, no less. So, nice try. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. You guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to help me continue making future videos, you can support this channel directly through Patreon. Become a patron for as little as $1 per month at www.patreon.com/TheMorgile, or you can support directly through PayPal to www.paypal.me/TheMorgile. You can email me at themorgile@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.
Make the earth shake. Rock, rock on. Make the earth shake. Rock, 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 rock on. Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake.